So in our last session, we finished off with the book of Joshua, and the children of Israel are in the promised land. They're getting victory everywhere under Joshua's leadership, but now Joshua dies, and we find it all goes downhill from there. Just quickly we're looking at the book of Judges. That's our next period of time. On page 46, clearly our picture talks about looking at Judges, and so that's where we get the idea. But our theme for Judges is cycles. We'll explain that in a minute. And there's 7 judges on bikes there, bicycles. And so there were 7 cycles recorded in this book, cycles of falling away from God. And so we'll explain that in a minute. So here they are in the promised land, and all they've got to do is follow God and stay separate from the local inheritors, drive them out. That's what they need to do, because it's taking time to do that. Nothing wrong in that. But we start with our notes here on page 47. The first point is deterioration. And the first point is the first cause was it was taking time to drive the inhabitants out. So I've got lots of verses there at different places. They drove the inhabitants out of this place, but not out of that place, because it was simply taking time. And they settled, though. They didn't keep pursuing this thing. And the second drama was then, because this is a new generation, and because they hadn't driven the old, the nations out, they were becoming familiar with these people living in the land, and they started to compromise with them, and they abandoned God and intermarried with these people and started going into the idolatry, the very thing that Joshua had warned them against. So let's pick it up, say Judges 2 verse 11. Or let's do verse 12. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and they bowed down to them. And that's a key idea here in the period of Judges. They kept turning away from God. In verse 6 of chapter 3, their daughters they took for themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. God had warned them, if you do this, I will discipline you, not to destroy you totally, but to bring you back. Why? Because he'd made unconditional promises to Abraham, and these promises would fall over if they turned away from God. And so God disciplined them to bring them back. That was the goal. So we see they've fallen away. And as a result, God then allows these nations to dominate them. So we put the heading there, the consequences of the deterioration. Verse 14 of chapter 2, he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies so they could no longer withstand their enemies. So this happens over and over. And we've got a cycle drawn here on page 49, which is the theme of our book. And we start with rebellion. They don't follow God. They marry the people they shouldn't. They start worshipping the pagan gods. As a result, we find retribution comes in from the hand of God. Through the neighboring nations, he allows them to dominate the children of Israel. Then when the children of Israel realize what's going on, they repent of this and they turn back to God, cry out to him. And God then raises up military leaders who are called judges. They're not judges in a law court as such. They're military leaders who by faith inspire the people, and they stand up against the nations. And under this leadership of the judges, they get victory. They are restored. But then time goes on. When that judge dies, the people go slack again. They go into rebellion. There's retribution that follows. They get dominated again. They repent. God raises up another judge and they get free. So we've got these cycles going through, and there are 7 of these cycles recorded throughout the book of Judges. Great, exciting reading, good stories to read. We're just giving the main idea here, so we're not looking at the stories. But I've listed the judges, I've listed the oppressing nations and how long they had peace and how long they were oppressed, just so you get the overview there. Then the book of Judges finishes with 2 or 3 different stories, just showing how they'd fallen away from God. And there's one story there, we'll just highlight one where a son had stolen some silver from his mum, but he returns it, and out of gratefulness for returning it, she then builds it into a little idol. And then they get his son to then be a little priest, although he's not of the right tribe, and they start worshipping the idol out of the stolen silver. And then another tribe come along, or a Levite comes along, and they grab him and make him the priest. And then another tribe comes along and they go, it's unfair that you've got this idol and we don't have, so they steal the idol and so on. And there's all these stories going on that talk about the fact that they weren't following God, they were just doing their own thing. But there's a summary verse or idea that summarizes this whole period, and it's Judges 21, verse 25, and it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." As a new Christian, I thought that was a compliment. But no, it wasn't. It's saying they were not following God. They were making it up for themselves. They were doing what was right in their own opinion, not obeying God. And that's where their problems came from. As an aside, I think every generation of Christians faces that challenge. Will we follow God and what he says? Or will we make it up ourselves and live life according to our own desires and so on? So we need to be people who follow God and honor him. That's the call upon our lives. And so that's what was happening there, and that led them into all sorts of trouble. Okay, we're going to move on to one of the judges. His name was Samuel. He was a good judge, and there's a book named after, in fact, 2 books named after him. And our picture here, we know this is the book of Samuel because we've got a mule whose name is Sam. So Samuel, there's only one of him, so it's 1 Samuel. And he's sawing a bit of wood with a saw made from the king saw company. And so we'll discover that 1 Samuel, although talking about Samuel as well and his life story, primarily focuses on the life of King Saul. So 1 Samuel is about King Saul. So we're moving into a new period of time, the United Kingdom. It's our first primary book of this period, and 1 Samuel is all about mainly King Saul's life. Before getting into Saul's life, however, the book starts with Samuel. His mother is barren. She pleads with God, "If you give me a child, I'll dedicate him to the Lord all the days of his life." And God answers the prayer. She has a child. His name is Samuel. And when he's weaned, she takes him to the temple and gives him to God, actually to be brought up by the priest Eli. And Samuel has an open heart to God, and he begins to hear God's voice. And Samuel is a good man. He follows God. Surprisingly, Eli, who's looking after him, he's a priest, but he's not such a diligent priest, and his sons are very wicked men. They are sleeping with prostitutes, and they are doing things with the sacrifices, consuming parts of the sacrifices they weren't supposed to do. So God actually causes the Ark of the Covenant to be lost and so on. But into that chaos, if you like, Samuel comes of age and begins judging Israel. And we're picking it up on page 55. We see here 1 Samuel 7, it says, "Samuel said to the people, 'If you return to the Lord with all your heart, put away the foreign gods, the Ashtoreth are with you, and direct your heart to the Lord, serve him only, he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines.' So the people of Israel put away these gods, and they served the Lord only." And the result was, chapter 7, verse 13, "The Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel." So Samuel was a great leader. He was a great judge, stroke priest, if you like, all of his life. But in that process, if you like, Samuel's sons didn't follow on with God as much as Samuel did. And so the people demanded a king, and under God's direction, again, we're doing this fairly quickly because we're just getting the big picture. There's more details in the notes that I'm going through. But under God's direction, Samuel appoints Saul as king and warns him essentially, if you follow God, you'll be blessed. If not, you'll have difficulty in your life. And although Saul was God's choice, we find that Saul has a sense of independence in his heart. In some ways, we could describe him as not really having a heart after God. And there's 2 stories highlighted in the life of Saul, where one was they were facing a battle against their enemies. And Samuel had said to Saul, "Before you go into battle, I will meet with you at a certain place. We'll make some offerings to God, obey him and get his blessing upon this, and then we'll go and have victory." But for some reason, Samuel delayed in coming. And because the armies were starting to go home and disperse from Saul, Saul panicked and took things into his own hands and made the sacrifices himself, something he was not allowed to do. And because of this independence, when Samuel comes and discovers what Saul has done, under the direction of God, he says, "Listen, the kingdom's going to be taken from you because you're independent of God. You're making this up yourself rather than obeying what God is telling you to do." There's another incident in the life of Saul where again he did that. They were attacking a certain group of people, and Samuel said, "Don't dedicate everything to God." But Saul didn't do that. He kept some of the things back, and Samuel confronted him and again reinforced the fact that God was going to take the kingdom from him. And eventually that was taken from Saul, and there was a transition then from Saul to the second king, whose name was David, the most famous of all kings. So David gets raised into the leadership. He's just a young boy. Well, again, there's lots of things we could say about him, but essentially he gets raised to prominence through the battle with Goliath, the giant. He's still not king. He's just a young boy that no one hardly knows. But now after Goliath, people know his name, and people are saying things like Saul has slayed his thousands, but David has slayed his 10,000. That's in 1 Samuel 18. And that makes Saul jealous. And from then on, David's on the run from Saul, but he has integrity. Several times he has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't do it because he's letting God be his vindicator. He knows he's going to be king, but he's letting God bring this to pass. And eventually Saul has a final demise. Saul's away from God now. He's still king, and there's a battle going on, and he wants the blessing of God. Samuel has died. He wants the blessing of God. And so what he does something that was totally forbidden. He seeks a medium, a spiritist, to call up the dead spirit of Samuel. In 1 Samuel 28, now, I don't understand this fully. It really was Samuel that he spoke to. We commanded never to do this, because most times it's a demonic spirit. It's not the actual dead person itself. But in this case, it was Samuel. And Samuel's really annoyed, said, you shouldn't have done this. And again, because of your disobedience, tomorrow you're going to be killed in this battle. You're going to be with me. That wouldn't have been a good message to hear from a dead person, would it? So they go into battle, and as Samuel predicted, Saul is killed, the army is defeated, and so on. But we'll finish this book. It ends in a sad tragedy. 1 Samuel 31, there Saul is wounded, fatally wounded. He falls on his sword to kill himself so that he's not abused by the army that's against them. And when they're going through the dead, they find his body. In verse 9, 1 Samuel 31, it says they take Saul, they cut off his head, take off his armor. And in verse 10, they put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall at Bethshan. I read that, and every time I read that, I feel so sad. He is a man who was God's choice, yet through disobedience and hardness of heart, he gets the kingdom taken away from him. But not only that, he dies a terrible death on the battlefield, and his body ends up being beheaded, and his dead body hanging against the wall. I think about that, and then it reminds me of maybe Christian leaders of past who were once used by God, but through independence, through disobedience, through sin, through temptation, through arrogance, through pride, all sorts of things, their end was not a good end. They were running with God for a while, but they turned aside, and some of them died away from God and so on. And I read that story, and it challenges me to pursue God and to stay humble and obey him. And it's not how we start the race, it's how we finish the race. And so 1 Samuel ends with this tragic end of the king, the first king of Israel, his body being pinned to a wall, and his enemies mocking him. So after the death of Saul, at the end of 1 Samuel, we move into 2 Samuel. And again, our picture, we've got 2 mules that are called Sam, hence the book. And if you know anything about King David, he was a harpist, a psalm writer. And so we've got, again, a harp made by the King Company, and there's a harp which gives us the clue that it's the life of David. So 2 Samuel is about King David, the second king in the United Kingdom, reigning over this United Kingdom of Israel. We start off by looking at David's tribes. He was a good king. Saul had really no heart for God. David had a great heart for God. And so we look at his political tribes. Again, for time, I'll let you read these in the notes yourself. But wherever David went, he got victory. Okay, and it was because he had a heart for God. He was obeying God. And then there are the spiritual triumphs of David. He understands the importance of God's presence. So with much dilemma and so on, he moves the ark to be closer where he is and sets it up and so on. And then there are these military triumphs where David gets victory wherever he goes. There's peace, well, not peace, but there's prosperity in the kingdom under David. He is a man after God's heart. But David is not perfect, and so we see the transgressions. The big notable story in David's life was he had an adulterous relationship with a woman called Bathsheba, and in an attempt to cover up the fact that she'd become pregnant, he tries to bring her husband back from the war, hoping he will sleep with her and that'll cover up this affair. But this man has integrity and doesn't sleep with his wife, and so they found out, and so David causes Uriah, her husband, to be killed in battle. And so David is not only an adulterer, but he's a murderer through other people. And so that has consequences in his life, and he's confronted with this sin by Nathan the prophet. But the good thing of David is when confronted for what he did wrong, he immediately repents and confesses. And in a sense, that, I think, saved his life. But there were troubles and consequences in his life because of that. And Nathan the prophet said, yes, you'll be preserved, but there will be problems in your family. And so when we find that happened, that later on, one of David's sons falls in love with his stepsister, Tamar. Amnon falls in love with Tamar, and technically he could have married her in their culture, but he couldn't wait, and he rapes her. And David seemingly says nothing, and this infuriates one of David's other sons, Absalom. He murders Amnon. And when David hears with that, he's of course furious of this happening. So Absalom finds himself on the run. But now, as a rejected son, Absalom over time gathers all the disgruntled people in the kingdom under his leadership and turns the tide on David. And David finds himself expelled from the palace and so on the run from his own son in his son's army. And there's quite a lot of stories there. But again, we're moving quickly. And again, just as 1 Samuel finished on a sad note, so does 2 Samuel. Absalom, the rebellious son, eventually is overthrown by David's armies, and which supposedly is good news. His followers think it's good news. But when David hears the story that his son has been killed in battle, we pick it up just very quickly in 2 Samuel 18 on page 67. He goes into the upper room and he cries out the cry of a broken-hearted dad. He says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, Absalom, my son and my son." And again, I read that story and my heart always breaks as a dad, loving my own kids. And I think, you know what, it didn't have to be this way. Again, David, in his humanity, was a good man. He had a heart for God, but in his humanity, he failed. And yes, his sins were forgiven, but there were consequences. And the consequences in this case were diabolic. It ended up in the estrangement of his family. It ends up with a sister being raped by a brother. It ends up with murder, and eventually ends up with the death of another son. And I think, oh, David, if you'd only stayed true to God and lived within the boundaries that God had set, it would have been different. Well, eventually, of course, David dies, and our story moves on to his next son who becomes king, who's Solomon. And we're moving on to 1 Kings now. And the picture here, I love this picture. We've got a king, and there's only one of them, so it's 1 Kings. And he's singing a song by himself, so he's singing a solo, and he's a man amongst the girl backing singers, so he's a man singing a solo, so he's a solo man. As the only man of the picture, he's a solo man. There's puns galore in this one. So 1 Kings is about King Solomon. Well, King Solomon, we know his story pretty well. He becomes king after David's death. And Solomon has a heart for God in his early days. He's very humble. God appears to him, 1 Kings 3, and says, what do you want? And Solomon, being humble, says, God, I'm just a young man. My father David was a mighty king. I can't fill those shoes. Please help me to lead the people wisely, and so on. And God likes that and responds and said, I will give you great wisdom and understanding so that you'll be the wisest man ever that's been on the earth. And not only that, I will bless you with great prosperity, and so on. And so Solomon, through his humility before God, ends up being the greatest king the world has ever seen in terms of riches and prosperity and wisdom and so on. And he ends up building the temple again, and God's moving very quickly on this. But in 1 Kings 6, when they build the temple, God's presence comes and fills the temple with his presence and so on. This is a high water mark. Life is as it was intended. God planned it to be this way. The children of Israel prospering, having peace on all sides, his presence there with them and so on. This is how God wanted it. But of course, humanity kicks in again. And we see that Solomon did the one thing that the children of Israel were forbidden to do and got them into trouble in the book of Judges, or the period of Judges, was Solomon took on many wives from the other nations that he shouldn't have taken. And yes, they led him into idolatry and led him away from God. And as a result, the kingdom gets taken away from him, not in his life, but after his death, and the kingdom just falls apart. And again, so this book ends with a note of tragedy too, or there's a note of tragedy halfway through this book, with Solomon, who was the wisest, most prosperous king, starting off with a heart after God, now turns away from God and starts worshipping these pagan gods. And because of the covenant made with Abraham, God says, I'm not going to let you continue this way. There will be consequences, not so that I will destroy you ultimately, but so that you come back to me. So this witness that I am the one true God will be maintained through future generations, and people will be blessed through me. So Solomon does live a prosperous life to the end of his days, but he does write the book of Ecclesiastes, which most scholars believe was written after he'd backslidden, and he's essentially saying in that book, I've tried everything in life and they were good, but without God, they were nothing. They didn't satisfy at all. And we find out the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, I think it is. He says, here's the issue of life. Seek God while you can, because life is brief. And he'd learnt through his own mistakes that life without God is meaningless. Even if you've got everything that money can buy and so on, that doesn't really satisfy unless God is at the center of our lives. Well, very quickly, we move on in our story now, still in 1 Kings, and we find Solomon's son, Rehoboam, takes control of the kingdom, and he's following his dad, and I think in an attempt to stamp his own leadership on this nation, he takes advice from the younger advisors, and they say, show yourself to be a really strong king, and so they decide that he will increase the taxes on the people. And although this is a very natural thing, it has spiritual consequences, and the people rebel against this increase in taxation. And God does raise up another person called Jeroboam. The names are unfortunately so similar, they get very confusing. But Rehoboam loses 10 tribes of this kingdom to another king called Jeroboam. And so the 10 tribes north separate from the 2 tribes left in the south, and the ones up north don't follow God under this leader, and the ones down south struggle with their relationship with God too under the leadership of Rehoboam. The bottom south tribes are called Judah from this time on, and the northern tribes are called Israel. And so we get now a succession of kings. Through the remainder of the book of 1 Kings and the book of 2 Kings, a succession of kings. And sadly, the history is as simple as this. Up in north, they're called Israel. There are 19 successive kings altogether, starting with Jeroboam, but none of them follow God. And meanwhile, it's not much better down south. Down south in Judah, there are 20 kings, starting off with Rehoboam. And of those 20, only 8 of those follow God. So the history of Israel is going downhill very quickly for quite some period of time under a succession of kings that essentially don't follow God. And this story is worked out more fully in 2 Kings, just very quickly. Looking at 2 Kings, our theme for 2 Kings, how do we get it from the picture? Well, now we've got 2 kings in the picture, so that's pretty simple. And these guys are doing something that's really hard for men to do. They're trying to find the eggs in the supermarket. And our theme of 2 Kings is exile. Okay, there's a pun there, work it out. And so 2 Kings follows the divided kingdoms. And they're not following God, or sometimes following God, but eventually God warns them and takes them into exile because they don't follow him. That's essentially what 2 Kings is about. And so I've given you a chart here on page 78, looking at the northern kingdoms of the kings that are in 2 Kings there, and none of those followed God. and so on. So eventually what happened in the north, God raised up prophets, warned them about it. That's where the prophetic books fit in. But then God raised up the Assyrian nation at the north to come in and take the northern tribes, those 10 tribes, into captivity. And we essentially don't hear of those nations or those tribes anymore. Down south, it wasn't much better. Only 8 of those kings followed God, and I've highlighted there some of the kings there and the ones that followed God and those didn't. But eventually they didn't follow God either. And so God allowed the Babylonians, who overtook the Assyrians. Eventually the Babylonians came down and they attacked now the southern 2 tribes called Judah. And over 3 different events, they took them into captivity in Babylon there. Let me read that in 2 Kings 24. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem. The city was besieged. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mother and his servants and his officials and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, carried off the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made, as the Lord had foretold through the prophets. He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. This is the lowest of low watermarks now in the history of Israel. The northern kings have been taken captive away. They've disappeared, it seems, from the face of history. And the remaining 2 southern tribes have now been taken captive as well. And not only that, but the temple's been destroyed. Jerusalem itself has been destroyed with the walls and so on. So we've got a chart there showing the 3 different times where the Babylonians came and invaded and took people back. So there was the first time where a small elite were taken. Daniel was one of that group of the small elite taken to Babylon, and he prospered there because he followed God and fitted in with the Babylonians. Then there was a second deportation where Jehoiachin, Ezekiel, Mordecai were taken into captivity. And there was a third captivity there, or deportation, where most of the people were taken, only leaving a small remnant there, and the Jerusalem and so on was devastated and so on. So we've ended up here with now the children of Israel no longer in the land that God had promised to them. And you could think it was all over now because it seems totally desert, total devastation. But God had made promises to Abraham. And these promises were one-sided. Even when Abraham was asleep, God made that covenant. And so God is not finished with Israel. In fact, the prophets warned that if they didn't follow God, they'd be taken into captivity. That happened. But some of the prophets also foretold that after a period of time of about 70 years, a remnant would return back under the grace of God, if you like, to start again. And that's where we pick up our story. The next phase in our story is the return. In the meantime, we've got this period of exile, which there are no clear historical books that outline all the stories there, but we have certainly got the book of Esther, a secondary book, which talks about life in captivity, Esther and her family, Mordecai and so on. We've got the prophetic books of Daniel and his relationship to the various kings of Babylon and then eventually Persia. We've got Ezekiel talking about the devastation of the destruction of Jerusalem, but also the promises of coming back. And we've got Lamentations where Jeremiah described the devastation of this captivity and so on. But again, spoke of promises in the book of Jeremiah as well that God would bring them back. So now we come to our final period in the Old Testament, which is the period of the return. This is, again, a good period in their history. And we're only going to highlight 2 books, if you like, Ezra and Nehemiah, the key historical books for this period. And looking at our little picture, just to get the name, it's a little bit cryptic, but you've got 2 letters, E and Z, giving us Ez, and they are football fans, whatever, in the cheer squad, and they're waving their little, whatever they are, pom-poms and go, Ra. So we put that together and we get Ezra to the name of the book. And Ezra's there, he's reading the law to the people, and the temple's in ruins, but it's being rebuilt. So the theme for Ezra is the rebuilding of this temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians 70 years before, and the restoration of the people back to obeying the law. So that's essentially what this period is all about. I've given you a chart on the top of page 83. We see the timelines here. Just as there were 3 deportations into Babylon, so there were 3 different groups of people that returned back from captivity under the Persians. Just filling in the gaps there, the Babylonians had taken them into captivity. Time had gone on. The Persians arose in power, overtook the Babylonians, and King Cyrus, the king of the Babylonians at the time, king of the Persians, he had a different foreign affairs policy, and he gave permission for any of the Jews to go back to their promised land. And this was prophesied actually by Jeremiah. And even Cyrus, even his name was mentioned, prophesied that he would be the one. So they are allowed to go back. So there's a first return under Zerubbabel. Okay, and King Cyrus says people can go back. Anyone who wants to go back can go back. And in fact, Cyrus then takes up money and starts financing the group to go back to reestablish the temple. Here's a pagan god fulfilling the will of God and even financing the project. That's exciting. Something like 50,000 Jews returned at that time. So they begin rebuilding the temple. But you notice in the chart on the top of page 83, there that the line goes dotted in the middle because they started rebuilding, but then the inhabitants that had been left in the land while the children of Israel had been taken into captivity, and the 70 years has gone by, they regard this as their land now, and they see the returning children of Israel as impostors, and they put up opposition against the rebuilding of the temple. And so the rebuilding is stopped for quite some time until eventually, again, the king of Persia, a different king now, says, no, this is what we're going to do. We are going to let this be rebuilt. And so he decrees that they can rebuild the temple. So they build the temple and again reintroduce the sacrifices. And again, this is a high point. This is, again, the fulfillment of the promises of God. Yes, they'd be taken away into captivity because of their disobedience, but God would again, out of his grace and because of his promises to Abraham, he would bring them back home. So it's all starting to happen again. They're back in their land. They're rebuilding the temple. It's all looking pretty good at this stage. But then we see our next return is under Ezra, sometimes later, and Ezra understands that the people are, although they're rebuilding the temple, that's been rebuilt, they're not really following God as they should. And so he leads another group of people back home with permission from the king. And Ezra's main concern is to get them to focus again upon the law and to obey God. And so he speaks into their lives. And there is, if you like, a mini revival under his prophetic leadership where the people do. And they've gone back to the promised land. But guess what? They're marrying the women they weren't supposed to marry again, and they're going back into idolatry. All these things that happen in the book of Judges are happening again. And so Ezra speaks into that and commands them to put away these foreign wives and turn back to God. And to their credit, they do for a period of time. Our third return is under the leadership of Nehemiah. And again, his book, he's focusing on the walls, and we've got our little picture of a man here standing in mud. In the Bible, we just don't talk about mud. You know, it's always got to be some spiritual thing. So we're going to call it mire. Remember those old choruses? He took me out of the miry clay. That was mud, wasn't it? And so he's standing in mud, which is mire, and it's up to his knees. And that's how we get the name of Nehemiah. And this little man is building the wall. So that's our theme, was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. The children of Israel have come back under Zerubbabel. They've rebuilt the temple. Ezra's come back and encouraged them to go back to God. There's been a mini revival. But Nehemiah realizes that they're still vulnerable to those inhabitants of the land until they get secure place in Jerusalem. So he leads another group back, and they go through a process of rebuilding. Well, there's opposition to their rebuilding, but Nehemiah puts various strategies in place to protect themselves while they rebuild. And by the end of Nehemiah, we've got the people again living securely now in Jerusalem with the walls established, the temple there. But you know what? There's a sad ending here too, because although they've got these things in place now, we find several things are happening. They are neglecting to support the priests. They're forgetting about the worship. They're not honoring the Sabbath. They're not sacrificing as they should. And yet again, they're entering into mixed marriages with non-Jews, the very thing that God had warned and warned and warned them not to do. So in a sense, we almost see history repeating itself. Through the grace of God, he's brought them back. There's been a mini revival under Ezra, but didn't last for long. And Nehemiah has to stir them up again, saying, listen, you've got to get back to God, because these very sins that we're committing today as this generation, he said, that's what caused our ancestors to be taken into captivity, and we're in danger of doing exactly the same things. And essentially that's where the Old Testament ends. And there are some other prophetic books, notably the book of Malachi, who again reiterates those challenges facing the children of Israel back in the promised land, again with options of promises and curses if they don't follow God. And that's where the Old Testament ends. Sadly, we said this in our introduction, the children of Israel, the history from there was not one of revival, was not one of being faithful to God. Yes, they became religious and they were offering the sacrifices and all those, but their heart wasn't really for God. And eventually they missed Jesus when he came, the promised Messiah, the very one they were all looking for. They missed him because their hearts weren't open to God. We understand that from the New Testament. Wow, what a journey. We've been on a long, long journey. If it's been a long journey for you, spare a thought for me, trying to get through 39 books in this short period of time. I hope it hasn't been too much detail. I hope you've gleaned the big picture, although there's much more we could say. But maybe let's finish by quickly recapping on page 70 in the appendix there. We've established a simple timeline for the Old Testament. We've broken it down into various times or periods called the beginnings, which was all about God creating. We've talked about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the promises made to them. We've talked about then the children of Israel under God's sovereign care being taken down to Egypt for protection of the nation, the children of Abraham and so on, the children of Israel now. And then God raising up Moses to bring them back through the Exodus. We've then talked about that generation of Moses could have and should have gone into the promised land by faith, but they didn't. And so God forbade that generation to go. They died in the wilderness, but then God raised up Joshua and the next generation to go in and take the land that God had promised to Abraham, and that's our period of conquest. It was a high watermark at the end of the book of Joshua, with the children of Israel following God, being obedient, and everything they did was prosperous, and all they had to do was continue, and all of that land would have been theirs. But as Joshua's generation died out and the next one arose, they disobeyed God and intermarried with the people they were supposed to drive out, and these people led them into idolatry. And therefore God allowed them to be oppressed by those nations. And we go into this period of Judges where they're oppressed, and when they turn to God, God raises a deliverer. They get set free for a period of time. When the judge dies, they fall back into their sins again, this period of cycles. Then eventually God raised up Samuel, the last judge, who's a good judge. They have prosperity under his leadership. And then there's a transition to kings under the United Kingdom. Saul, a man who is God's choice but has no real long-term heart for God. David, who has his faults but does have a heart for God, and because of that there's great prosperity. And Solomon, who starts off well, following God with humility, and God blesses him abundantly with great wisdom and prosperity. But again, Solomon's heart is turned aside to other gods through marrying pagan women. And eventually the kingdom then is broken into two under Solomon's son Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the other king. The kingdom's divided into Israel and Judah. The kings up north don't follow God. The people don't follow God. So eventually they are taken into exile by the Assyrians. The tribes down south, Judah, there's 6 of those kings that follow God, but that's not many out of 20. And eventually their apostasy causes God to discipline them by bringing the Babylonians in to take them into captivity. God then raises up the Persians. They were in exile then for 70 years. God raises up the Persians to send them back to their promised land. They go into the land under Zerubbabel's leadership. They rebuild the temple. Under Ezra, there's mini revival turning back to God. And under Nehemiah, there's the rebuilding of the walls. But sadly, the Old Testament ends with this open-ended option, follow me and I'll bless you, Or if you don't follow me, you're going to miss the promises. And that's where the Old Testament ends. Well, much more we could say, but I do pray that this has been a start into the Old Testament. Please note, I've given you lots more notes. There's C and D. Where we've gone through pretty well every book of the Old Testament, given a theme, an outline of the story, and so on, much more detail that we can cover here. But I do pray that this simple overview will at least give you a foothold into the Old Testament. So the next time you're reading an Old Testament book, you can remember back or even get the notes out and find out where it fits in the story. And then that book will make far more sense to you as you read it. Let's just pray as we finish this series. Father, again, we thank you that throughout all of the Old Testament, we see you to be a consistent, loving, fair, just God, who out of your grace created the world that we might have a relationship with you. And then you chose one man, Abraham, so that he would be blessed and his descendants would be blessed, so that ultimately all of the nations of the world would be blessed through them. And we see that fulfillment through Jesus, and we thank you for that. Lord, we do pray that we will be people who read your word diligently and help us to read it intelligently, understanding your emphasis and the things that you're wanting to say to us, so that our faith is inspired, but more than that, so that we understand you and your heart more and see your faithfulness and your commitment to us. And again, we thank you, Holy Spirit, for being with us. Thank you for whenever we open up your word, you are there to speak into our hearts. And we again honor you today. And we thank you again in Jesus' name. Amen.